Some of you may have noticed a running theme of the last 6 or so of my analyses. For those of you who didn't, allow me to spell it out for you. Each of these stories has a moment or concept that could be considered problematic in regards to sexually exploiting the underage main characters of this show. Yeah, strap in, this is going to be a tough one. Just a few quick words here. I do not condone the sexual exploitation of underage individuals, real or otherwise. I am not here to defend such actions, but rather to determine whether or not that is in fact what is happening in the first place. I briefly touched on this issue in my first video essay by just saying that the problem didn't exist and moving on. However, I didn't put too much thought into it at the time. It wasn't until I saw Made in Abyss, Eromanga Sensei, and the biggest problem in anime by Explanation Point that I started to really think about this. You see, Explanation Point as part of his video lists a bunch of anime from 2018 that sexually exploits its characters. And Karakai Jozu No Takagi-san was a part of that list, albeit separated from the rest with arguable written alongside it. This made me begin to wonder whether or not the show had the same problem as shows like High School DxD or Eromanga Sensei, albeit far less extreme. If there is one thing that is not up for debate is that Takagi-san can get inappropriate. There are themes of sexual attraction in this show between middle schoolers, and it's not exactly a show I would allow a small child to watch. However, a question I want to ask is whether or not this content is problematic. Meaning, does this content sexually exploit its underage characters to titillate the audience, as opposed to using this content to add to the story they are trying to tell? This is what I am here to figure out. So how will I do this? Well, in Explanation Point's video, he looked at the overall themes of Made in Abyss and concluded that the inappropriate content was necessary for the story they wanted to tell. I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to go through a select range of stories, pick out the inappropriate parts, and run them through a test to work out whether or not the inappropriate content was necessary for the story they wanted to tell. Some of you might be thinking that High School DxD and Eromanga Sensei did use their inappropriate moments to convey the story they wanted. However, what's important to note here is that those shows are considered to be part of the ecchi or pervert genre, whereas Takagi-san is a slice of life romantic comedy, so it does not get that excuse. Remember in my ribs analysis when I talked about viewing this story through a lens? Well, for the sake of this essay, I will be viewing the show through a few different lenses. Firstly, I will be looking at the show through the lens that most of Takagi's teasing is somewhat working towards the betterment of Nishikata, making him a better potential partner as well as a better person in general. I will also be viewing it through the lens that the events taking place are happening in the early days of a relationship that will one day turn into a marriage that produces a child. However, the one lens I will not be using is a lens of a fan who wants to like this show. I am, of course, but allowing that to get in the way could potentially compromise this breakdown in the show's favour, which I don't want to do. If I'm going to put this behind me, I need to know that I gave this discussion a fair chance. If this show slips up, I will not go easy on it. Let's start with an easy one, a story that only the most conservative person could ever find a problem with. A story that is only part of this video because I arbitrarily decided it should be when I came up with the list. Ribs. The only thing that could be considered inappropriate about ribs is the poke towards the end. This really isn't a big deal, but for the sake of getting you and myself ready for the harder stuff, let's put it through this test of mine. The first question is, how does this contribute to the narrative? And as I said, the purpose of this poke, if viewed through the lens that I mentioned earlier, is a plan by Takagi to normalize physical contact between her and Nishikata. It's a small step, but a step all the same. Even if we observe this story in a vacuum, it is merely a resolution for the story. Nishikata lost a game. Takagi comes up with a punishment that is narratively fitting for the game they were playing and the tactics they both used, or in Nishikata's case, a tactic he didn't use. Also worth noting is the presence of consent from Takagi. Next question, how does it contribute to the tone? It doesn't have too much impact on the show's tone at all, other than reinforcing the upbeat, innocent tone that the show maintains throughout most of its run. The tone question barely applies to any of the other stories I've selected, so you won't be hearing it often, but there is a reason it's here. Trust me. And the last question, was it necessary? Well, yes, both as a resolution to the story and as a fairly important piece of Nishikata's development. Even though they begin the show as friends and end the show as friends, this doesn't mean that there is no progression. However, this will likely have to be an essay on its own. Honestly, the only reason Ribs was part of this discussion in the first place is because it's a story where there is both physical contact and a mention of sexual harassment, but it really doesn't belong with some of the other stories I'll be looking at today. Just consider it to be the tutorial level for the rest of this essay. Okay, let's get into something that might get under the skin of people who aren't super conservative. Kickover. So, what's wrong with Kickover? Well, it's a story in which Nishikata watches Takagi do a trick that has her school skirt moving in a manner that will expose whatever is underneath. Of course, what is underneath is a pair of shorts, so no explicit damage there, but is the mere concept enough to condemn this story? Well, let's put it through the test. How does this contribute to the narrative? Well, it serves a few purposes. Firstly, as a demonstration that Takagi takes these games as seriously as Nishikata, and will not cheat at them even if given the chance to. It also goes to showcase just how good she is at manipulation. She likely knew it would turn out this way, otherwise she wouldn't have worn the shorts at all. And from a predominantly foundational point of view, this is the climax of this particular story. Now, some may argue that a climax like this may be enough reason to scrap the story. However, I must play a card that I don't intend to play ever again after this one instance. But I feel like it's worth saying here. What's the harm? Nothing revealing is shown. The longest any observant viewer could think the story is about to get inappropriate is a second. And Nishikata didn't even watch for the sake of peeping, but rather for the purposes of assuring that the game was being played properly. Well then, was it necessary? I would argue that it is, given everything that we get to learn about the characters from their reaction to this event, or the fact that the event even happened at all. I would argue that losing this particular climax would take away the aspect of Nishikata's honesty and defeat, as well as his flustered nature in these types of situations, and Takagi's manipulative ways. The next story on my list is Pool. Pool is a story with multiple aspects that one could consider problematic, so I will list them out and put them all through the test at the same time. So there's the topic of menstruation or periods, the observation that Takagi has small breasts, shots that are exclusively focused on Takagi's chest, and the end of the story that depicts Takagi stripping her PE uniform off to reveal the swimsuit underneath. Looks like we have our work cut out for us. First question. Does this contribute to the narrative? Well, it's made clear by the end of the story that periods and Takagi's small breasts were both brought up in the first place because Takagi subtly brought them up. If there are two things that this story tells us, is that Takagi knows how to get into Nishikata's head, and that Nishikata is downright ashamed when he thinks about these types of things. The shots of Takagi's chest are likely meant to be POV shots from Nishikata's perspective, being a way to visually confirm what he is talking about. As for the end of the story, when Takagi strips off, this is a way to deliver the twist for the end of the story, that shocks the viewer as much as it shocks Nishikata. Speaking of Nishikata, these things also provide a lot of character detail for him, namely in the way that he reacts to thinking about these topics. As for the necessity of these attributes, it's an early story that shows us so much about Nishikata, everything from the situations he imagines to the way he finally makes his guess. Both go to show how timid and conservative he is when it comes to sexual health, particularly that of a woman. Before I move on, I'd just like to take this chance to say to my mostly male audience, if you're the type of guy who gets grossed out or uncomfortable when periods are mentioned or even implied, do yourself and every woman from 10 to 60 years old you know a favour and get over it. Really, just get over it. Like I said, the shots of Takagi's chest are likely POV shots, maybe not necessary per se, but logical at the very least, given the words being thought as these shots are presented to the audience. And the strip-off at the end was necessary to deliver the twist ending in a manner that made it most satisfying to see. Now let's move on to Swimsuit. Swimsuit is a bit of an odd case in this essay, since the aspects that some could perceive problematic span most of the story. That being the mere fact that Takagi is dressed in swimsuits, some more revealing than others. There are also individual elements, like Nishikata thinking about what's going on behind the changing room curtain, or Takagi pretending to be undressed and dropping her cover. However, it is at this point that I have to reiterate a point I made in my original essay. Moments like this are present more so to get Nishikata's reaction to them other than being titillating to the audience. However, we are still yet to run these aspects of the story through the test, so let's do that. How does this contribute to the narrative? Well, the main intention is to showcase Nishikata's reaction to the entire ordeal. It also further establishes some traits that we already knew about the characters. That Takagi is a manipulator that's able to put ideas into Nishikata's head, and that Nishikata is timid and reserved kind of fellow at heart, even if his pubescent mind can lead him down some pretty strange roads, which I believe explains the thoughts he has in this story as well as another which we will get into later. So is it necessary? Well, I would argue that this particular story isn't as vital to the overall show as Critical Hit or Seating Arrangement might be. It is still an important story to the show, likely around the same level as Room or Two Choice Question. All of the elements in this story, the fact that Takagi is in swimsuits, the trick she pulls on Nishikata, and the thoughts that go through Nishikata's head all come to present the situation that makes this story important. It presents Takagi with a situation where she is made to realize that she has gone too far. And that premise would not have worked as well had this been a more safe story. Now we arrive at Shelter from the Rain, and there are a fair few aspects of this story that could be considered problematic. You have the fact that Takagi's shirt is wet and therefore a little see-through in the beginning. You have shots of Takagi changing out of a wet shirt and into a dry one, and you have Nishikata having probably some of his most inappropriate thoughts in the entire show. So how do these aspects fare in our little test? How does it contribute to the narrative? Well, again, this story mostly revolves around Nishikata and his reactions to certain situations, even though Takagi has far less input in this situation than she does in other stories. I mean, she didn't choose to get wet, it just happened. She did choose to tease Nishikata by telling him that he can look if he wants, but that's more or less as far as her influence goes. The fact that Nishikata definitely respects Takagi's privacy without any room for compromise, and the fact that Takagi doesn't seem to be embarrassed or uncomfortable in the slightest, definitely gives this show some points. But were these moments necessary? Well, the wet shirt was the catalyst for the main conflict of the story, and just like I said in the analysis for this story, Nishikata's thoughts were there further to clue us in that he is just a kid going through some changes, most of which he finds frightening and shameful, evidenced by how harsh he is on himself for having these thoughts. However, the shot of Takagi getting dressed, and please hear me out, is probably the most necessary part of the entire show in regards to preventing the exploitation of the characters. Now you might be thinking, how does showing an underage girl getting changed prevent exploitation? Well, I'm sure you've heard that the best horror movies are the ones where the monster is a mystery. This is because the human imagination is so good at filling in blanks that we are better at scaring ourselves than any movie ever could. This is the same for several aspects of media. Let's say that this story was shot in a way where we didn't see Takagi getting changed at all. That would leave what she is wearing under her shirt to the imagination of the viewer. Instead of doing that, they showed us what she was wearing, which appears to be more like a singlet or a tank top than any traditional fan service underwear. Even the way that both the manga and anime present these shots with Takagi's back to the camera just goes to show how little the showrunners were interested in making this a titillating display. They force you to see what's going on to prevent your imagination from putting her in something less tasteful. And that appears to be it. I'd like to think I've been fair and objective throughout this video, and I honestly do believe that any potentially problematic elements of this show can be explained with reasoning that does not involve fan service or even resorting to tired defenses like it's just anime or the characters aren't real. I feel like the show has been carefully crafted to be careful with its more promiscuous subject matter, and as a result does not come off as exploitative or offensive. At least, that's how this essay would have ended if this show had ended with seating arrangement, but as you know, it didn't. Nope, there is one more episode that follows the season finale, one that I will need to talk about here. Any of you who watched the outtakes for my waterslide analysis would have heard me say this. Before I get into some of the things this OVA did well, I just need to say I did not enjoy it as much as I hoped I would. Don't get me wrong, this is not a bad episode of Takagi-san, but let's just say there was one aspect of this OVA that really bothered me. I haven't mentioned it in this analysis and I won't be mentioning it here either. Instead, I want to make a separate video about it, but that's a little ways down the line. And here is the reason why. This story takes the crystal clear reputation of the rest of the show and basically throws it all away. Don't get me wrong, I can get behind the fact that the characters are wearing swimsuits. They are at a pool after all, and a big part of the story is Nishikata's reaction to having to deal with Takagi wearing a swimsuit. I'm talking about more specific stuff than that. This shot of Mano is something I can defend. It's a POV shot from Takagi in order to give Mano a confidence boost that will play into the rest of the narrative. This shot of Takagi leaving the pool serves no narrative significance, but it's harmless enough. But then you get shots like this. This shot serves no narrative purpose and is unnecessary to the point of being troubling. I mean, there are 1,000 ways you could have shown Takagi getting into the waterslide, and you went the one that shows the contours of her butt. Why? Nothing like this was in the manga, so why is it here? But despite serving no narrative purpose, there is a potential purpose it serves towards the tone of the story. Yeah, I told you I'd bring tone back eventually. Now please understand that this is absolutely a stretch and not something that will make the OVA any more palatable for me personally, but it's still an observation that needs to be stated. Despite the show being named after Takagi, it is clear that Nishikata is the protagonist. It's his thought process that we're exposed to. The animation serves to show us his worldview, so there is a potential defense for this shot and others like it. Throughout this story, Nishikata is so nervous around Takagi that he can barely function socially, so it could be that the showrunners put shots like this into the show to intentionally make the audience feel uncomfortable, and therefore put us into the same shoes as Nishikata. Like I said, it's a massive stretch and not one that I personally buy into all that much, but still something that I believe needed to be said regardless. So, is Karakai Jozu no Takagi-san a problematic show? No, it isn't. It slipped up a little during the OVA, but other than that, it consistently justifies its less palatable themes by the nature of the story it is telling. It is a show about two kids falling in love and growing as people, and part of growing up at that age is exploring and accepting things like physical attraction and urges. And to leave those aspects out would leave this show a lesser product than it is now. I still love this show to bits, and I will continue to analyse the stories as well as write about the various aspects in detail like I have done here. Although hopefully the following video essays will be much more fun and much less collar-tugging to write and to watch. Until then, remember that you can see the notes and outtakes on my website, links in the description. This might be a good time to check out the outtakes and notes because at one point I basically completely rewrote this essay, but I still recorded the old one, just for the sake of outtakes. If you want to see the films I write and direct, you can see them on my parent channel. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.